Senator from Ohio.
Madam President, earlier today, the Senate voted to proceed to debate on legislation called Bring the Jobs Home Act. And it's about tax reform. It's about the tax system in this country. I'm glad we're having the debate. I voted to proceed to that debate. I think it's really important that we talk about it. I had a reporter come up to me earlier on the floor today, and he said, I hear that Democrats are going to talk about inversions. That means when a company in the United States goes overseas, buys a company usually smaller than they are, and then inverts, meaning they become a foreign corporation. And they said, you know, are you concerned about that? I said, no, I think that's great. I think we need to talk about it. I think it's a hidden problem that no one's talking about, and I think it's terrific that we're talking about it. So I hope that's what will happen over the next week here on the floor of the Senate, is that we'll have an honest conversation about what's happening in our great country, where you have more and more American companies that say because of the tax code that they are saddled with, they cannot compete around the globe. So what do? Having a responsibility to their shareholders, they go and find either a foreign company to become part of, then become foreign, or they make themselves a foreign company by being acquired by a foreign company. Some of them are simply not growing because they can't compete with other companies from other countries that are buying some of their assets. I had a company recently come to me from Ohio, my home state, and say, you know, we do work in Korea, and we were in South Korea. We wanted to buy this subsidiary there so that we could expand what we're doing in Korea and push more of our product there, more of our exports there. We finished the negotiation with the Korean company, and a company from Germany stepped up and said, you know what, whatever you guys have negotiated, we'll take it, but we'll pay 18% more. And the reason the German company could pay 18% more is that their after-tax profits were higher because the German tax code treats the German company better than the American tax code treats the American company. That's the reality, and it's happening. Over the last 5 years, they say there have been 35 American companies that have gone overseas through these inversions, but there are also a lot of American companies that have become foreign entities. I'm a beer drinker, and it is hard to find an American company that can sell you a beer these days. Why? Because they're almost all foreign companies. The two largest American beer companies each have about 1.4% market share. Sam Adams and Yuengling, great beer, by the way, but this is sad to me. It doesn't mean these companies have all left the United States. A lot of them still have production here, breweries here, and so on. But by headquartering somewhere else for their tax purposes, we lose something as Americans. We lose executive jobs over time. We lose this intangible thing, which is companies that are willing to invest in our communities. In your hometown, like in my hometown, probably everything you're involved with on the charitable side, some local companies been involved with and helped with. A lot of them tend to be some of these international companies that do a lot to help make our cities a better place to live and to work. But they do it partly because this is where their headquarters is. This is where their towns are. If they're not here, if they're in Dublin, Ireland, or if they're in London, England, or if they're in Beijing, or if they're in Rio in Brazil or somewhere else, they're not going to be making those investments. So this is a big deal. It's also a big deal because it's not just about the inversions. I see that as kind of the tip of the iceberg. It's also about all these companies that are losing right now in foreign competition because, again, they can't compete. They have to pay more in terms of taxes than their foreign competitors, so their foreign competitors can afford to broaden their market share, get more customers, can afford to buy a company when one comes up for acquisition. I had a fellow come in recently from the Boston area, and Boston does a lot of biopharma research, as the president knows. And it's very exciting what's going on there. And throughout our country, we're still doing just top-notch research. And they showed me the list of companies that have been purchased in the last 4 or 5 years. And unfortunately, the majority of those companies were purchased by a foreign company. So it wasn't by a U.S. company coming in, consolidating, it was by a company that is under different tax laws, a Swiss company or a French company or a German company or a Japanese company that had bought an American company. The majority. By far the majority. This is happening all over the country, and it's happening sort of under our noses. You know, we're sitting here in Washington allowing this to happen because we are abdicating our responsibility to reform the tax code so that it is competitive. And by the way, we're the only country that's not waking up to this. Every single one of the other developed countries in the world, the countries that are members of what's called the OECD, which is all the developed countries, every single one of them has reformed their tax code, except us. In the 1980s, we did establish this rate that we have now, which was 34 now, then it's 35% now. When you add the state tax rates, you know, for companies, it's about 39% on average in America. We're the highest rate in the world. So at the time we set our rate in the mid-30s, that was just below the average. So it was done deliberately. It was done as part of the 1986 tax reform. We said, well, let's set the business rate at something that's below the average so we can be competitive. But since that time, we've become the highest rate, and every single one of our developed country competitors, all of them, have reformed their tax code and lowered their rate. But they haven't just lowered their rate to make us number one in the world, which is not a number one you want to be if you want to compete and develop jobs. They've also reformed their tax code to make it more competitive internationally. Now, we haven't done that. You know, we have been bystanders in this effort to attract jobs and investment and opportunity. We still have what's called the worldwide system, where we don't tax income where it's earned. And that has created a real problem. So I'm glad we're having this debate on the floor. I'm glad there's an opportunity here to talk about this. I must tell you that the bill before us, the Bring the Jobs Home Act, is not going to help, unfortunately, because it doesn't get at this underlying problem we've been talking about today. It does nothing about lowering the rate. It does nothing about changing the international system of taxation. It tinkers around the edges with one issue, and that is to remove deductions and tax credits that, according to the authors of the bill, they say incentivizes companies to move overseas. There's a group here in Washington called the Joint Committee on Taxation. They're nonpartisan. They tell us in Congress what tax policy means, how much it costs, what the effect's going to be. Here's what they say. They say, and I quote, "Under present law, there are no targeted tax credits or disallowance of deductions relating to relocating business units inside or outside the United States," end quote. So why are we having this debate? Why aren't we debating the core issue, the real problem? I guess because this is a better political debate, and it's just easier to do, but it's not going to help. It would be nice if there were these targeted tax credits that some of the authors claim, because then you could get rid of those. That might help some. But as the Joint Committee on Taxation has said, that doesn't exist. Let's take a look at the numbers. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, these very small tweaks this legislation will make to the tax code by disallowing some of these deductions will amount to around $143 million over 10 years. So $143 million over 10 years, they say, will be, because even though there's no targeted allowance or targeted tax credits, they think this legislation will have some effect the way the IRS will interpret it. And by the way, it's left up to the IRS to interpret it, and it's a subjective decision by the IRS since it's not targeted. But let's say that $143 million over 10 years is the right number. That's what the Joint Committee says. $143 million over 10 years. Let me give you one example. There's a company in Ohio that's about a Fortune 200 to 300 company. So it's a big company, not the biggest company, but it's a big company in Ohio. They decided a year or so ago to do this inversion. They bought a company that was 1/4 their size overseas, and they became a foreign company. Based on the public filings, we know this year that company will save $160 million on its taxes because it chose to become a foreign company. That's wrong. Our tax system should be fair, it should be competitive, it shouldn't be driving these companies to do this on behalf of their shareholders and under their fiduciary responsibility. But that's $160 million a year. Versus this bill that, even if it works as the folks are talking about, is intended to be a $143 million impact over 10 years. Do you see what I mean about this not being a serious proposal? Let's get at the core problem. Now, the other problem is if you continue to make it harder to be a U.S. company, whether it's to take away a tax credit, whether it's to take away a deduction, whether it's to do something else to try to block inversions, what will happen? What happens every time you try to put up a wall to stop something, but don't deal with the underlying problem? These companies will continue to look overseas, and they will be targets for acquisition. I mean, look, we talked about the fact that, there's no American beer companies anymore except ones that have less than 2% market share. These companies didn't invert. They were bought by foreign companies. And that's happening right and left in America. And that's what would happen even more if you make it even more disadvantageous to be an American company because you're trying to block this. You've got to get at the core issue. You can't have the highest tax in the world, and you can't have an international system that's not competitive and hope to have these companies stay American companies. So let's deal with the underlying problem. 35 companies over the past 5 years have chosen to invert, but so many others have done other things to try to be competitive, including to sell to foreign companies or not to grow, not to be able to compete with acquisitions, not to be able, because their after-tax profits are not as high as their foreign competitors. It's not going to be easy to do tax reform. I understand that. And it's never easy. That's not what we were hired to do, is to do easy things. What we're on the floor right now debating, this proposal that is called, Bring Our Jobs Home, which I think is a misnomer, unfortunately. I guess that'd be easy. It wouldn't help, but it would seem easy. Tax reform is going to be hard because you do have to lower the rate and broaden the base and get rid of some of these deductions and credits and exemptions and so on that are out there. The tax code is now riddled with them. Everybody likes their special provision. But it's an effort well worth undertaking because it's about our economy, it's about our future, it's about our kids having jobs here, it's about keeping American companies here. We simply have to do it. By the way, Congress has done this before. We did it back in 1986. It was led by a Republican, Ronald Reagan, and a Democrat, here in the Senate, Bill Bradley, in the House, Dan Rostenkowski, Tip O'Neill. I mean, this was a bipartisan effort. It should be again. There's no reason it shouldn't be bipartisan. The president's talked about it as a big problem right now in our economy, that our tax code is so inefficient, antiquated, it needs to be updated. He's talked about lowering the rate, broadening the base. I agree with him. Let's do it. Unfortunately, we haven't seen a proposal from the administration. We had a hearing on this recently, and I asked the administration, where's the proposal? And they said, well, we're interested in working with you. Great, I am too, and all of us are. Some Republicans, including Dave Camp, have put out very specific proposals in the House Ways and Means Committee. We've got to move forward on this. And we've done this before. We can do hard things. It's our job to do hard things. We did welfare reform a year before an election, actually months before Election Day, with President Clinton working with Republicans, including Newt Gingrich. This seems to be the kind of thing that's harder and harder to do around here, and yet there's more and more urgency to do it. People call it corporate tax reform or business tax reform, and you think, well, it must be about the boardroom and about the executives. It's not. It's not. They'll be fine either way. You don't need to worry about them. You need to worry about the workers. CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, which is the group that analyzes legislation for us, has looked at this and said, you know who is hurt most with these high corporate taxes that we have? It's the workers, of course. More than 70% of the burden, they said, is borne by the workers in the form of lower pay, lower benefits, and fewer job opportunities. So we need to do this not because we're looking to help the boardroom, but because we're looking to help the American worker at a time when it's already tough. Over the last 5 years, they say average take-home pay has gone down about $3,500 for a typical family. So pay is not going up. Pay is stagnating and has gone down. Healthcare costs have gone up. In fact, they're skyrocketing. I talked to some folks in Ohio last weekend who said, why aren't you doing more to get healthcare costs down? And I said, well, I didn't support the Obamacare proposal. It was promised that the costs would go down. They're now going up. That's why we need real reform of the healthcare system. But this is a squeeze. It's a middle-class squeeze. You think about it, healthcare costs up, wages down, now stagnant. This is an opportunity, not through a sideshow like we're going to see on the floor here talking about how to do these tweaks that aren't going to make any difference, but to really get at the problem is a way to get payback. That's what the Congressional Budget Office tells us. Our tax code should draw companies to our shores, should bring investment here, bring jobs here, instead of pushing companies away. All we're looking for is a level playing field. If Americans have a level playing field here, we will be able to be competitive. We will be able to create jobs. We've got the greatest innovators in the world. We've got the greatest research. We've got this incredible infrastructure in this country. We've got a lot of advantages. Our energy advantage now, thanks to what we're doing on private lands. We should do more on public lands, but thanks to what we're doing on private lands, is really giving us an advantage in terms of stable supply of relatively low-cost natural gas, particularly for manufacturing. We see this in Ohio. It's a great opportunity. But to take advantage of that opportunity, we've got to reform and improve these basic institutions of our economy, including the tax code. And by the way, it's not just the tax code. It's also about regulatory relief to ensure that American companies are not being saddled, as they are now, with higher and higher costs and more regulations that makes it harder for them to compete, makes it harder for them to create jobs. It's about being sure that we have a trade policy that actually works to expand exports. Huge issue. In my own state of Ohio, we do a lot of exporting. We could do a whole lot more. 25% of our factory jobs are now export, trade jobs. 1 out of every 3 acres planted in Ohio is now exported. We want to do more. That gets the price up for the farmers. That's adding more jobs and creating more opportunity for good paying jobs, because these trade jobs tend to pay more and have better benefits. We're sitting on the sidelines there too. Congress could move very quickly to provide this president with the negotiating authority that every president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt has had. Since FDR, every president has also asked for it. This president has now asked for it. You heard in the State of the Union earlier this year. He hadn't asked for it earlier in his term, but now he's asked for it. Let's provide it to him. Let's give him the ability to knock down these barriers to trade for our workers, our service providers, our farmers, to get this economy moving. Along with tax reform and regulatory reform, these are things that would actually make it better for the American people. On the regulatory side, I am offering a couple of amendments in the context of this legislation, and they are bipartisan amendments. One has to do with ensuring that we do allow companies to permit something more quickly. Right now, it can take years to permit a project in the United States of America, so we have a bipartisan bill. Senator McCaskill and I are the 2 lead sponsors, but we have other Democrats and Republicans on board saying, this is just common sense. Let's make one agency accountable. Let's be sure that there is a way for everybody transparently to look at a windshield and see what the status of the project is to move it forward. Let's reduce some of the legal liability in some of these projects. What people tell me, whether it's the solar companies who I talked to yesterday, or whether it's some of the oil and gas producers, or whether it's some of the wind companies, or whether it's the hydro people who brought this to my attention initially a few years ago, they can't get foreign investors because it takes so long to permit something in America now. We used to be at the top of the heap on that, by the way, and now on these annual ease of doing business surveys that are done, America has fallen behind. America is now something like 34th in the world in terms of the ease of doing business on permitting, because more and more regulations have been added. Sometimes for an energy project, it's up to 34 federal regulations. Usually it's one after the other because there's no coordination and accountability. So that's what this bill does. It's very simple. It's common sense. It's already passed the House. It's a kind of bill that if we passed it, actually would create jobs and good construction jobs, which is why the building trades support it. And by the way, the labor union, building trades, and others who support this kind of legislation do so because they figured out that America cannot be competitive unless we have these basic institutions of our economy, whether it's regulatory reform, or whether it's a smarter energy policy, or whether it's the ability to have a tax code that works. They want to be sure that we are expanding opportunity for their members. So I appreciate the building trades stepping forward on that. The other one is simply to make sure regulations are accountable, make sure there is a cost-benefit analysis, make sure we use the least burdensome alternative in Washington, D.C. to get to a policy that's enacted by this Congress. Common sense stuff. Again, that's already passed the House too with bipartisan support. So I am offering these because I do think it's important for us to have this debate on tax reform, and I look forward to the further debate on Monday and Tuesday of next week. I think this is a great opportunity for us to talk about the real problem. I'm not going to support this solution because I don't think it'll help, but I welcome the debate, and I'm glad that we proceeded to this debate, and I'm glad that my colleagues on this side of the aisle are raising this issue. And to that reporter's question that I got today, are you concerned that Democrats are talking about inversions? No, I'm really happy they're talking about it. We should all be talking about it, Republicans, Democrats, independents alike. As Americans, we should be focused on this issue and the broader issue that by our companies not being competitive, we are hurting American workers. And if we don't turn this around, not by show votes, not by something that looks good politically but isn't going to make any difference, but by actually getting at the root of the problem, the highest rate in the developed world, an international system that doesn't let us be competitive globally because people can't move around their assets to find the best, most efficient use for them. Those two issues, if addressed, will unlock all kinds of opportunity. That's the potential we have. There is a better day ahead, right around the corner, if we do some of these basic things. I was also asked today at a press conference we do every week with Ohio reporters, how would you grade this Congress? Are they doing the things they ought to be doing? And I said, I got to tell you, there's some small things that have been done, but no, Congress is not doing the work of the people. And the work of the people, at its core, means that the laws, the federal laws, that this place alone, the House and the Senate and the President, have control over, those laws need to help the American people to be successful. It needs to be an environment for success, an environment for people to be able to say, hey, my kids and grandkids could have it better than I've got it because we see America on the upswing. That's not what we see today. The weakest economic recovery since the Great Depression. I talked about wages going down, not up. I talked about the higher cost of health care. I talked about the fact that we have now in this country a lot of people who are discouraged about the future. CNN did a poll recently, and you know, normally you ask a poll, do you think your kids and grandkids do better off you? People say, yeah, that's the American dream. The next generation is going to be better off. That's what my grandparents believed. That's what my parents believed. That's not what today's generation of parents believe. 63% of people said, no, I don't believe that's going to happen. What's even more troubling to me is that 63% of young people do not believe that. They don't believe that their lives will be better off than their parents. We can and should change that. I hope we'll get a vote on these amendments I talked about. I hope we'll have a good discussion, debate over these issues. We owe it to the people we represent to solve these big problems. I thank you for the time, Madam President. Yield back my time.